It's office makeover time. Ever since I laid my eyes on this beautiful custom-built arch bookcase, I knew I had to make one for myself. So let's do it together. I don't know about you, but I find shopping for supplies so exciting. There's just something about starting a new project. I headed into my local Bunnings, which is only 9 minutes away from my house, and I am so lucky that I have a Bunnings so close because I frequently attend here. I grabbed all of the base materials that I knew I was going to need for the bookcases and loaded them into the ute. Now, the first part to any project is planning. And planning sometimes can change as you're working throughout the project. And I like to get all of my materials and get a feel for the project before I actually start doing my planning. So what I'm doing here is I'm working out what I'm going to need for the size of the base that I'm going to build, how much I need to cut out of the cornice and also of the skirting board, and then the distance I'm going to have when I build the bookcases. So what I've done here is I've got my two pieces or the long pieces of timber that I'm going to be using for the base. When I've put those down on the ground, it actually sits a little bit higher than my old skirting board. So what that means is this back piece of skirting board can actually stay there, which will save me a little bit of time going along with a multi-tool and cutting that entire piece of skirting board off. And then I can actually sit the bookcase on top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build my frame that little bit smaller so that when the bookcase sits on the frame, then I'm going to have it nice up flush against the wall. Once I've got that, I can cut all the little pieces that are going to go in between my frame and then take this outside into my workshop and screw the frame together before bringing it back in and attaching it to the wall. Now, what I'm going to do on the top is I'm going to then use the multi-tool to cut out the cornice, because I want this to look like it is flush with the room. So let's jump into some work and get started with our tools and start building out this frame. So I got myself a new Bosch miter saw and it is so nice to use, but it is a little bit too big for my workbench. So my workbenches, they're not wide enough to allow enough distance for my miter saw. Whereas my old miter saw was much smaller in size. This one obviously has a lot longer of an arm and I can do some much bigger, more detailed projects with it. However, now that I've got this miter saw, I don't have the bench space for it. So I'm either going to buy the bench that goes with the miter saw or potentially make myself another workbench just to sit this on. I'll probably end up getting the workbench that goes with the saw just because I am going to be doing a few projects at different locations and it's just going to be a little bit easier to then move around and take with me to my work sites. Now we're building out the frame and what I'm doing here is I've got the measurements of the small cuts that I need to put in between the frame. And so I've got 14.5 centimeters or 145 millimeters. I'm just going to make one cut to cut the rough bit off the end. And then I'm going to start cutting up a few 14.5 centimeter pieces. So I can mark the line and then cut it so that I've got a nice cut. So I'm probably going to need to cut about 10 of these to do the full length of my frame. So I'm just going to go along and cut a whole lot of them at the same length. Perfect. So I'm going to just keep measuring those and cutting a few more of these. so I've built the frame and now I'm going to start working on my first bookcase. As always, the measurements are the most important component to this. So what I've done is I worked out the spacing that I was going to have for the shelves, allowing for the thickness of the timber on each side, and then worked out what I would need to have 3 bookcases fit along the length of the wall, allowing a little bit of space on each end that I'm going to then cover with the framing. So what I've done is worked out that I need to cut the height of these down by 3 mil, and then the shelves are going to be 1170 wide so that I can fit 3 bookcases along that wall. So I'm going to start off by cutting down the top or the edge panels that I'm going to cut down just by 3 mil, just so that they can fit underneath the original roof, because what I've decided I'm going to do there is to just cut out a small component of the cornice. Unfortunately, my house is built with a metal frame, and so when they were installing both the skirting board and the cornice, they've gone straight through that into the metal frame, which means that they're not actually just nails that are easy to pull out by using a crowbar. It does actually mean that they're screwed into the frame, which then makes removing my cornice and my skirting board much more difficult. So what I'm going to do is I'm only going to remove a little bit, and then I'm going to put a new cornice on the front of the bookcase and just build it around the original cornice. Now, because these boards are fairly wide, I need to make sure that I have my arm unlocked so that I can pull the arm forward, drop, and then slide all the way back to make sure I cut through the full width of the board. So to do that, I just loosen off here. Make sure it's loose enough that I can slide my arm all the way forward, and then I can cut back through. I need to measure just my 3 mil because I'm only going to be taking 3 mil off here. And then I'm going to line that up with my laser guide. Now, when I'm cutting this, I need to be really careful of my fingers and make sure that I'm holding the board, but that my fingers don't go anywhere near the blade. And I should have been wearing safety glasses and earmuffs then. Don't do what I do, do as I say. Now that I've got my 2 side pieces that are going to be the right height, I need to cut my shelves, which is going to be my top and bottom of the bookcase. So for this, I'm going to be making them 1170, which is 117 centimeters. So I'm just going to measure that, mark it with my ruler. Before I do that, I might actually just quickly go along and very carefully cut the edge off the board, because I don't want that rough edge as the edge that I'm going to use. Usually when you buy timber from the store, it's going to have a rough cut on the end, and so I don't want that rough cut to be what I have for my shelf, because I want my shelves to have a nice flush cut on the end. So just cut off the rough cut if you've bought timber from the store like I have. The problem then is that my measurement is then going to be wrong, so I'm just going to remeasure this. So my 1170 is going to be a little bit further over. Now that I've removed my rough cut. Now, to attach the frame to the floor, I actually ended up deciding, instead of screwing it this way through the frame into the wall, I was going to then install it using the L brackets and putting it through the frame and then into the floor. So to do this, I've got my Dyna drill, and I'm going to just drill the hole into the floor, and then put in a wall plug into the floor, then screw straight into that. And then once I've done that, I then just screw this into this part of the frame, which will then hold that, and it's going to make it a lot stronger than if I was just going to nail straight through the frame into the wall. It's also then going to stop it from lifting at the front, because I've got some brackets on the back section, and then I've also got some brackets that I'm installing on the front section, and it's just going to make it that little bit stronger. So the Dyna drill drills straight into the concrete slab. Then once I've drilled into the concrete slab, I just got to use my vacuum to make sure I get rid of all of that dust there. I'm going to put the plug in the hole, and then I need to use a hammer to hammer that down into place. Vacuum it up again. And then I can get the L bracket and screw in that first screw. So then that's all screwed in and attached to the frame. Cut it out. Now that the frame is all attached to the floor, I'm going back to building the bookcases. So I'm now just cutting down all of the shelves. All 3 of the bookcases are the same width, so they are the 1170 wide. So I'm just going through and cutting 5 of these all at the same length for each of the bookcases.
Day 1 is over and it's now day 2 of building my built-in bookcase and my office makeover. Now, day 1 wasn't a typical full work day because I do pick my kids up from primary school. I'm a mum of 2 young primary school aged children, and so I always do school drop off and pick up. So my days are a little bit shorter. So if you had a full working day, you would get a little bit more done in the day. But what I did in day 1 is I managed to cut all of the timber that I've got for all of the bookcases. So I've got all of that cut up, ready to go for the other 2 bookcases as well. I've built all the frame and installed the framing into the office space, and I've installed and put together one of the bookcases. Now, ideally, if I had enough time, I would try and paint these before I installed them. But today is the weekend and I've got my husband home. And what that means is I've got a second pair of hands that can help install these bookcases. They are quite large and they're quite tall, so just under 2.4 meters. And I'm going to be anchoring them to the wall so that they are fully secured against the wall and there's no chance of them falling down, especially having young kids. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get him to help me install them, and today is the only day I can do that. So ideally I'm going to try and paint as much as I can, but if I can't get very much painted, I am just going to then do the painting once they've been installed. It's just going to be a lot slower because it's going to require a lot more cutting in. So I'm going to be painting the bookcase black, and I'm going to then paint around that. If I can today, to try and give myself a little bit of a heads up, I'm going to just paint one paintbrush strip around the back end of the inside of each of the shelves, which is going to be the part of the shelves that's sitting up against the back panels, so I don't have to cut that all in by hand. Also, I would like to try and put a clear gloss over these back panels, so once again, I don't have to do that after it's installed and work in each of the individual shelves. I am going to definitely sand it down while it's still one big panel, but if I don't get around to getting the clear coat on it, I can always do it with a brush and a roller once it's been installed. So let's jump into the action today. So the first thing that I'm doing today is I am just giving a top coat sand to this wood. Now this is a hardwood topped ply, so it has just got basically a really nice piece of wood on the front and then it is a plyboard underneath. And so what I'm doing is just giving it a top coat sand with a 180 grit. I need to use a fairly high grit here, so a 180 or a 240 would be fine. And then once I've done that, it's all just nice and smooth and doesn't have any splinters on the surface. Okay, so I'm putting the bookcases together by screwing them together from the outside. Now the reason why I'm doing this and not using pocket holes is because we're not actually going to see any of the framing because they're all going to be joined together. So from the outside screwing in, I'm not going to be able to see any of that once it's all been built in and framed. Whereas if I did the pocket holes, it just takes a little bit longer. I don't necessarily need to do that for this particular project. However, you can definitely join this together with pocket holes if that's what you want to do. Because my timber is quite thin, I don't want to split it. So what I'm doing is I've got a countersunk drill bit. So I'm just using that first. Then I'm pre-drilling the holes. So as when I put the screws through, I'm not going to split the timber. So I'm just lining it up and getting it perfect. I'm then, once I've got it in place, doing a little countersink. Once I've got the countersunk hole, I then use the same size drill bit as the countersink and just drill through. And then it's just a matter of using the drill to put the screw in. So it will then countersink. And pull it all together and get it nice and flush. So I'm doing 3 screws on each shelf, just in case I put something quite heavy on the shelves. So that if I show you up close from the inside, you'll be able to see that there's no splits in the timber and that it's all really neat and tidy. So now that I've got the frame together, it's a matter of putting in all of the shelves. So the shelves are just going to slide in between the frame. Now the spacing for the shelves, I've got 2 guides that I'm using to space out the bottom 4 shelves. The bottom 4 shelves are all the same distance apart. And then the top shelf is bigger because I'm going to be putting the arch framing on that shelf. So I'm just spacing out with these spaces, all of these in-between shelves. And then once all of the in-between shelves are on, I'm then just using whatever space is left at the top for the top rung. So I'm going to start installing all of these shelves.
Thankfully, I'm really lucky to actually have 3 drills, so I was able to just use the 3 drills with the different attachments on them and not have to continuously swap between the attachments. So I had one with a countersunk head, one with the drill bit, and then one with a Phillips head, which I was using to put the screw into the timber. But you can just swap between them on the one drill if needs be.
So I've now got 2 frames done, and those 2 frames I'm going to paint the first coat of the black just on all of the edges so that that can then dry, and then I can paint the second coat, and then I'm going to be building the 3rd frame as well. So I just want to make sure that I've got one strip of the black so I don't have to cut in really fine once I put the back panels on. Now, because I'm putting the back panel on, I don't need to worry about painting the actual back face. It's just where it's going to butt up against the panel.
As with all of my videos, I get so many questions about all of the materials and the products that I've used throughout the transformation. And so I wanted to let you know that I will be putting links down for all of the particular pieces of timber I've used, all of the paints I've used, including the colors that I've used, the paintbrushes, everything that I've used in this makeover down in the description, so that you can easily find what it is that I've used, especially if it's going to be one of your first DIY projects. It can be really difficult to decide what materials you're going to use, and you might spend a huge amount of time at the hardware store. So Bunnings is my favorite place to be, and all of the materials that I've purchased for this particular project I have purchased from Bunnings, and so you'll be able to get all of those products at your local Bunnings hardware store.
So I now need to cut the back panels down to size. So I'm just going to measure the length of this and cut the length down first. So if I make it 241, that just gives me a couple of mil difference. So I'll cut it down to 241. I'm just going to measure the 241 in a couple of different locations. Now, because I'm cutting a really thin material, I'm actually going to put masking tape across here and then re-measure my line, because I want to cut along the masking tape so that I don't end up with a whole lot of splinters. So I can actually see my line underneath that. So I'm just going to rule it.
After I do a cut with the circular saw, I just like to use the orbital sander to just give it a quick sand down, just to make sure that there is no splinters on the piece, especially because I'm going to be handling it and carrying it, and I really don't want any of those edges to go into my fingers or my hands.
So I've now cut one panel down to size, but while I'm waiting to do the other two panels, I'm just going to put the second coat on the black edges, and then I'm going to cut the other two panels down to size as well.
my guide rail is actually a little bit short for my piece of timber. My guide rail is only 2.1 meters, but my piece of timber is 2.4. So I actually need to put my guide rail on halfway and then stop my saw, move my guide rail along and then cut the rest. Ideally, it would be much better if you had a guide rail that was the full length of your piece of timber, but this is a makeshift version that I have done given my circumstances. You need to make sure that the clamps are out of the way of the saw. So for example, I can't clamp on this side, I need to clamp on this side so that I can fit my saw the whole way through. Now that I've got it re-clamped, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift the guide rail up, or I'm going to lift the guard up on my saw so that I can get my blade open and then sit that back in that gap that I've already cut. I'm going to move it back slightly, turn my saw on, and then I'm going to be able to cut the rest of this. So whenever you put a first layer of top coat on, it actually lifts the grain a little bit. And what you need to do, especially when you're working with certain timbers, is put a first coat of your top coat on and then do a really light sand with a really high grit, like I'm talking a 400 grit or a 600 grit sandpaper. And then once you've given it a light sand, you can then put your second coat of the top coat on, which is going to leave you with that really nice finish. So I'm just going to quickly roll on a first coat of top coat, and all I'm doing here is just getting this to lift the grain in my timber. And I really don't need safety glasses on right now, but they're kind of acting as a bit of a sunglass for me because it is so sunny. I'm usually quite a cold-blooded creature, but it's about 33 degrees currently, and so even I'm starting to feel a little bit hot now. The weather also means that this top coat is pretty much going to dry instantaneously as soon as I paint it on. It's in 33 degrees sun. The paint doesn't really have a chance. So ideally, you know, you wouldn't be painting in this hot temperature. But as I mentioned earlier, I've got some assistance to be able to install this today. And so I'm going to persist so that I could install these bookshelves today so that then I can start building out all of the framing tomorrow. For this top coat, I'm just using a clear water-based polyurethane. And I wanted to use water-based so it has a quick dry time, whereas an oil-based would have, 24-hour dry time, which is just not going to work for me for this particular project. So I put the first coat of the top coat on, and now I've got my sander with a 240 grit sandpaper. I'm just going to go through and do a light sand once again, and then once I've done that, I'm going to add another top coat. Now, if you're using a hand sandpaper, I would suggest you use either a 400 or a 600 grit, but when you're using the orbital sander, typically they only come up to 240 in the sheets. Just sort of depends on the sandpaper and where you get your sandpaper from. So for the top coat of the top coat, I'm actually going to use a spray gun to spray it on because it just gives a nicer finish and it's also super quick to use. Okay, so now it's time to attach the back panel onto the frame of the bookcase. So I'm just going to be using a stapler to staple this frame on, and then that'll all be installed on the back, ready for us to carry them inside. So with a bit of a helping hand, I've now installed all of the bookcases onto the wall. It's now day 3 of this project and we're going to start framing out all of the cabinets. But before we do that, I'm going to talk you through the process about how we installed it. First thing I did is I needed to get a helping hand because, as I said, they're quite heavy, and to be able to lift them up and maneuver them on to the frame that I've built, it was much easier to do with 2 people holding them. Also, when we screwed them and attached them to the wall, it was much easier for somebody to be pushing and holding it against the wall while it was screwed into the wall. So the different attachment points, we needed to have quite a few attachment points here because the weight of anything that gets put on the bookcase could then bring the bookcase forward. So we want to make sure that it is really secured to the wall. So the first thing that we did is we used clamps to clamp the bookcases together and then screw each of these together so that they were joined. Once we joined all of them, we were able to then screw through the base of the bookcase into the base that we created. So the bottom shelf straight into the frame that we created. I'll show you up close as I'm talking through all these little different bits and pieces that we did. We also then had to put a bracket along the top. So here you'll see this back plyboard that I've used is only 6 mil thick. So it's not thick enough to be able to secure into this. And because we're going to be putting an arch on this top, it means that you're not actually going to be able to see that section there, and you won't be able to see that bracket. So what I'm going to do is, while I will paint that black still after I put the arch on, I'm going to put the arch on and then that will be hidden from view. So we put that bracket on there and then screwed straight through the bracket into the metal studs in the wall. Now, I'm not sure whether I advised you already, but my house has got a metal frame, which just makes it a little bit more tricky than sometimes if you have a wooden frame. I definitely would not build another metal frame home because there's so many things when it comes to adding bits to the home that makes it so much more difficult when you've got a metal frame. The last thing that we did is we then attached it to the wall. Now, because there's a gap here, we needed super long screws, but we were able to drill straight through this panel on the side into the wall and then into the metal frame. So we just screwed straight into that metal frame and just secured that at a few different points along. Then we have it all nice and secured to the wall, and today we're going to be doing the framing. So I'm going to use an MDF board that's going to go around the outside and then also to create the arch. And then on top of that, I'm going to add all of this beautiful detailed moulding. So I'm just going to get some measurements for this first panel. I am going to need to cut a section of the cornice out so that then I can slide this panel straight up against the wall there. So I'm just going to get my multi-tool and cut a small section of that out. The other option is I could do that and then create a curve on the end that goes on the outside of the cornice. So what I might do is cut it down to size, not including the cornice, and then I'll have a look at what I think, whether I'm going to cut that section out or whether I'm just going to curve the end there. 74 height wise, 124 width. watched me cut the MDF board down to size and then make the first arch for the first bookcase. We're now going to make the second arch together, and I'm going to talk you through the process as I do it. The first thing that I did was cut the MDF board down so that the width and the height were correct for the exact size of the bookcase. Now on the two end pieces, I did allow for a little bit of an overhang to cover the gap between where the bookcase and the wall are. Once I had the whole panel the right height and width, it was then time to create the arch. For the first arch, I used a piece of string and a pencil to mark out a half circle. But for the second one, I wanted it to be exactly the same as what I did for the first one, even though the arch was definitely not perfect, because using a pencil and string to create an arch was much harder than I thought it was going to be. But I wanted all three of them to look exactly the same, even though the first one wasn't perfect. I didn't want to then have one dodgy looking arch and then two really good looking arches if I got the first one wrong and then got the second ones after better. I clamped the first arch to the second arch to make sure it would stay in the exact position, and then just used my pencil to mark out where it was going to go. I then clamped the entire MDF board to my workbenches and used my jigsaw to cut out along the line to create that semicircle and arch. Once they were all cut out, it was time to go and install them. So what I've just done here is I have placed a support arch or bracket there for my arches. So the arches, because they're sitting on top, I don't want them to like concave in the center. So I've put this bracket here so that I've got something to nail into when I install the MDF arch. I could have cut the top strip a little bit smaller and then had some of the arch that went up over this section, but I've already cut it, so I may as well just add these in. You can't see them under the arches anyways. So I'm just now going to cut out my cornice on this side, put in my other panel. I'm so excited with how this project is turning out. Honestly, it's one of my favorite projects I've done to date. The arches on these frames look so good. Even though they're not cut perfectly, there's a little bit of difference in each arch, but overall they're looking spectacular. So today is day 4 and I'm now going to be adding the molding. So I've boxed out and framed everything, and then I've added the MDF to cover all of the holes and fill in all the gaps. Now we're just going to add the detail molding on. Picking the right molding was a really hard choice when there's so many amazing options to choose from, but I managed to find the perfect pieces. Once all the molding's been added, I can then just fill in all the nail holes, sand off any excess that I need to, use the no more gaps to fill any gaps that there is left, and a little bit of caulking happening, and then I can get to painting. So I'm adding the molding to the front of this board at the base, and it's just going to be a wood finish with a solid straight top. Now the kickboard here has to go up against where I've got the old skirting board, but it doesn't quite fit in the gap that I've got there, so I just need to use the multi-tool to cut a tiny little bit more out. So I think it'll probably fit in there now. So if I just slide it down into place, beautiful, it goes all the way through. Now my floor is also a little bit uneven, and this actually sits up a little bit higher than what the bottom shelf does here, but then on this side it's nice and flush. So I'm probably just going to sand down the top of that just to get that all flush as well. So now I'm gonna have to cut the corners out a little bit further on this side as well to allow for my front to go in. So it needs to come out 11 mils. So I'm going to go a little bit bigger than that just in case. So I've now got the top and the bottom framing on, and that's all complete, which is amazing. All I've got left to do here for the molding is to do each of the individual strips. So I've got the 2 end strips and then the 2 middle strips. I'm just cutting between that top molding and the bottom molding and filling in between. And the molding that I'm using is 11 mil thick, which is going to butt straight onto those straight boards that I've added in. And then that wall is complete, other than filling in all the nail holes and doing all of the no more gaps. Once all of that's complete, I can finally get to painting up. But before we get to painting, I am going to be putting some picture frame molding on this wall as well. And I'm going to picture frame mold the whole wall and then leave a nice big space in the middle where I'm going to actually put a picture in the middle. So my workshop is an absolute mess at this point, but I am going to clean it all up once I have finished all of my cuts and installed all of my pieces. Now I'm just cutting next the middle strips, and I'm just cutting them with my miter saw, making sure that I have my fine blade on, because these are really thin pieces and I don't want to chip them. So I measured this against the wall so that I could get it right, but I'm also just going to tape measure this just so that then the next piece that I cut, I can get it at the same size. I am also going to cut it 1 mil too long, because I'd prefer it to be that little bit too long than too short. So we've got 236.9 or 2,369 if I'm going in mils. So I'm just going to transfer this line around onto the face so that I can easily see it when I've got the drop saw up. Now, usually when you've got a drop saw, they're going to have a laser guide on them. So I absolutely love the laser guide. I can't live without it. It just gets my cuts perfect. And so if you put the laser directly in the middle, you're actually going to end up with 1 mil less because of the thickness of the blade. So I usually typically move it a little bit to the side, just so that it cuts perfectly down the side of that line. And I get it to the exact measurement that I want it to be at. So I've cut that, and now I'm just going to hook the tape measure onto this next piece and mark it out. It unfortunately, once again, is a 36-degree day, so I'm like sweltering and sweating here. I'm now just going to go through and cut each of these individual pieces of molding to the same length, and then once they're all cut down to size, I can then go back to the room and install them. Now that I've finished the bookcase wall, it's time to move on to this wall. Now on this wall, I'm going to be doing picture frame molding, and what I'm going to have is a larger size picture frame on the top and then a smaller size on the bottom. So the first thing I had to do is do out my drawing and my measurements. So I did a couple of different drawings, and then I ended up with, once I was happy with the sizes, or approximately the sizes, I started working out all of my measurements. Now I don't want too much of a gap in between each of them, so I'm just going to be doing a 130 mil or a 13 centimeter gap between each of the different picture frame boxes. Same as what I did in the toilet. So if you saw my toilet makeover video, you would have seen me do small picture frames on the top half of the paneling, but this is going to be a whole wall. So we're going to do one big frame at the top, which is going to be 2/3 of the wall, and then one which is going to be 1/3 of the wall at the bottom. Now this section in the middle here is really large, because what I want to do is I want to have a really big space there, which I'm going to then put a picture in. So I'm going to buy a picture canvas, something along those lines, that I'm going to put in this section. Ideally, eventually, I'm probably then going to put some lights in either side panel, but for now, all I'm going to do is put the picture and then just have the picture frames on the wall. So now that I've got my measurements, I need to go out and do all of my cutting. So I'm just going to cut it all in one sitting, and then once I've got them all cut, I'll just come in and install them onto the wall. Just going to remove these old shelves that I had on this wall. It's really weird, but when I installed that, I put one side into a anchor and not the other side. So those holes are all going to have to be filled, but I'll fill them after I have put the new picture frame moulding on, I think. Actually, I might fill them now, just in case the picture frame moulding ends up going over the top of them. So this is going to require a lot of 45-degree cutting. So I'm going to need to turn my blade . It's another day and we are back at it again, working on this bookcase and this room makeover. We're up to day 4 now, I believe. All the days kind of just blend together, and today for me is a really short day. I really don't have very much time to get much done in this space because my kids are at home this morning and then we have their twilight sports this afternoon. So I really don't have very much time today. But I am hoping to get all of the holes filled and get the actual building phase completed so that I can then start painting. I'm so happy with how it turned out. All the moulding's now gone on and I have finished the moulding on the feature wall as well. So I just need to go through and fill in all of the nail holes and then have the no more gaps that just got to go around all of the outside components on both the picture frame moulding and also the bookcase. Then once all of that's done, all I need to do is get my painting done and then I can start styling the space. Now, the opposite wall here around the window and then the wall that's at the back of the room, because this space is going to have 2 dark walls, I want to paint a reasonably light color on those 2 walls, but I also wanted to have a little bit of warmth in it, so a little bit of brown and cream undertones. I've been to Bunnings and I've got 2 sample pots that I'm going to just place on the wall. Just going to paint a patch of both of these colors on the wall and see which one I like better. Then once I'm happy with the color that I've selected, I'll just go back and get some more paint. I've got plenty of the black paint already because I've used that throughout my entire house. That is Monument, a color bond color, and I use it for pretty much everything. Now, it's not actually a deep black, so it's not a true black. It's more of like a really dark charcoal color. But to me, it is almost as good as black, but it does have a little bit more warmth in it than just a harsh black color. So Color Bond Monument color, and then I've got here Buffet Quarter and Buffet Half. So I'm not sure how dark I want it to be, but I've had these 2 colors mixed up and I'm going to paint the sample and then I'll show you that on this wall and then we can get to painting once I've filled all of the cracks. So that is the Buffet Quarter, and it's really quite a light color compared to the color that I already had on the wall, which was what I would probably call like a latte color. But I will also paint another little sample down the bottom, just above my cornice, because I would like there to be a little bit of contrast between the white on the cornice and the paint color, which I don't think I'm going to get from this color. I think it's probably going to be too close in color. So we're probably going to end up having to go with the Buffet Half. But I mean, I do like this color. It's just very close in color to the cornice. So it's not really going to be much of a difference, which has definitely got a bit more creamy undertone. And it's got to have enough of a contrast that we're going to be able to see it. My skirting board was painted white by the builders who built my house. And when they painted the white skirting board, they used a white oil-based enamel. And so this house is now 5 years old, and unfortunately it is quite yellow. It has yellowed quite a considerable amount over time. And this here is very yellow compared to what an actual white would be. So I'll probably end up repainting over this with a white water-based enamel so that we don't end up with having that yellowing effect. But for now, I still think that we've got a nicer contrast with this color than we do with this color. Even though I still really like this color, I just don't think it's going to create enough of a contrast, especially in some sections where I've got the paneling on the bottom half of the wall and I'm just painting the top half of the wall. I do want to have that little bit more contrast to it. So when I say I'm going to fill all of the nail holes, these are all the little holes that I'm talking about with the little nails where there is a gap. Now, I could just go ahead and paint these, but then I'm going to have a whole lot of little holes in what I've painted. So ideally I want to go along and fill all of these little holes. So I'm just going to take my little spatula and my filler, and I'm just going to go along and fill all those little holes. Now, ideally I want to have the smallest amount of excess that I can, so that then when I come back and I do my sanding, I don't have a huge amount to sand off, because the sanding is by far the hardest part. So we want to make sure that we don't leave too much excess on the wall here when we apply this filler, because then it's going to make it so much faster just to sand the excess off. I've now finally finished all of the construction, all of the building work, all of the prep work, and I am now ready for my favorite part, which is painting. So I'm going to be painting 2 coats on the frame and the base of the bookcase, and then also 2 coats on the opposite wall. I've chosen to go with the buffet half, which is the slightly darker color, because I think it's going to look a little bit nicer up against the white. And then we're going to stick with the black on this wall and this wall, leaving this stunning timber at the back of the bookcase. So let's jump into painting.
I've seen a lot of change, been through a lot of pain. Some things are not the same as they were a year ago, but all will be okay. I move on each and every day. The past is where it stays, way back a year ago. I've changed for the better this time. I thought I would never be fine. I strive just to say I'm alright, and for the first time in a long time I'm alright. I've seen a lot of change, been through a lot of pain. Some things are not the same as they were a year ago, but all will be okay. I move on each and every day. The past is where it stays, way back a year ago. I'm not falling, I'll push all my chips and call all in. I'll bet on myself, you keep stalling. I hear destiny and it's calling. I'll keep my head up high through the downs and lows, and we're all going live. Still nobody knows, but I'ma choose what's right and take what comes and goes. And ain't no one in life holding me back no more. I've seen a lot of change, been through a lot of pain. Some things are not the same as they were a year ago, but all will be okay. I move on each and every day. The past is where it stays, way back a year ago.
I finally finished all of the painting. I worked until 7:30 last night to get the second coat of the black on the bookshelves because I really wanted to get it finished yesterday, and then today I could have a play around with styling and go shopping and buy a whole lot more stuff to be able to fill these bookcases with a really nice modern vintage country style. So I've got the black and I've got the cream in this space. I'm wanting to add greenery, a little bit of gold and that really vintage kind of feel, and some more timber elements. And what I'm going to do is go shopping and find a few bits and pieces that I can use to style these bookcases. Now, when styling the bookcases, I want to try and have a few different elements. So I'm going to use a few pictures and picture frames, and then it's all about creating different heights. So I want to have some tall vases, some small bowls and small vases, some baskets, and a few different elements that I can mix in together to start playing around with to create the style that I'm looking for on the bookshelves. I'm also going to move the desk into position, and then once I've got the desk in position, I can decide whether I'm just going to keep my classic black office chair or whether I'm going to go shopping and possibly buy a new office chair as well. So I've got a picture that I'm going to be putting on this wall, and I'm going to put it in the center point of this picture frame, and then I'm just going to bring the picture in and sort of mark the height that I wanted. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just work out where the center point is and just mark the wall with the center point. So this is 96 wide, so half of 90 would be 45, half of 6 would be 3, so we've got 48. So 48 is approximately center point, so where I've got my thumb here. So I usually just do this by sort of estimating because I want to have it like approximately center. Probably just a little. So I'm just going to put the anchor into the wall first. So now that I've got that anchor in, I can just put a screw in the wall. So I'm going to start out by placing some piece elements. While I was in the middle of styling the bookcases, I had a thought to myself that I would really like to add one shelf on the other side of the room that I could use to put my more expensive equipment, my camera equipment, and those sorts of things to keep them up high and out of reach of my children, but also so that they were not going to affect the aesthetics of my bookcase once I've styled that perfectly. I had an off-cut piece of timber from the bookcase shelves that I had, so I just added some timber stain to this to make it a little bit darker in color, and then I went back to Bunnings again and purchased some owl hooks in a brushed brass that were going to tie in perfectly with some of the vintage styling on the bookcase. Once the timber stain had dried, I installed the shelf on the wall. Now, let's take another look back at my plain old boring office before this makeover. And now let's take a look at this one-of-a-kind beautiful office. It was definitely a lot of work, but in my opinion, it was totally worth it. I hope you've enjoyed sharing this makeover and watching the process of how I created these custom arch bookcases. Remember, all of the products and materials I've used are linked down in the video description, and make sure you hit subscribe to come back and see what makeover I'm going to be doing next.